everybody, Carmen here, and for this week's How Do I, we are going to talk about how do I fix my sewing machine when it is having some problems. So I don't know about you, but sometimes when I'm sewing, my machine just doesn't work perfectly, right? And I think this happens to most of us. For me, it happens often in the middle of the night as I'm frantically finishing a project for someone, right? That is the time that all of a sudden my machine says, hey, no thanks, I'm tired too. But there are a couple of different things that I'm going to talk about today that can give you some tips of things you can do at home to test your machine to see if you can get it resolved and you don't need to bring it in to a store to have fixed. There's obviously some problems that we can't fix at home, but these are sort of tried and true, and these are the things that I do every single time my machine provides a hiccup. Okay, and when I talk about a hiccup, what I really mean is, I'm going to show you some examples here on some fabric. What I really mean is things like bird nesting. So you can see here I've got sort of a bird nest. This is the bottom. This would be the top here of my, if I flip it so you can actually see it here, this is the top of my sewing, right? It looks fine on top, beyond the fact that I didn't sew straight, but the top stitches look fine. But the bottom has this sort of like bird nest. There's like something going on here. And so generally, just so you know, if your top stitches look fine, if your bottom stitches are having problems, your bottom stitches are always actually connected to your upper threading, so your upper tension. And generally speaking, when you get a bird nest like this, it's something to do with how the thread is either coming off the spool or it's not actually in your tension guides, that sort of thing. So bird nesting is a really, really common thing. And when bird nesting occurs, the thing that I would always want to do is I would want to re-thread my machine. So here's my bird nesting. I would want to cut my threads, pull them out, and I would want to re-thread. And you want to make sure that when you're threading that it's getting in your tension disc. Almost all sewing machines thread in a very similar manner, meaning you've got thread over here, it goes through some guides, and then it goes into a tension disc. Now, many of the newer machines have a flat lay-in tension disc like this. If you have an older machine, you might have a dial out here that's actually like a knob, and you have to make sure that it gets in between the tension disc. And the way tension discs work is when your presser foot is up, your tension discs are open like this. So one of the things that can sometimes cause misthreading in your tension disc is if you are threading with your presser foot down. So you always want your presser foot to be up, so your tension discs are wide open. Okay, so that way you can make sure you get into those tensions. And if you have a knob out front, you want to make sure you've wrapped it around and it goes through that little spring, so that way it's in the tension disc. Okay, so I've got this guy here. I thread this up here, and then I can take this down, and then you would re-thread your needle as well. This machine has a great needle threader on it, so voila, needle threaded. Love that. So for bird nesting, that is the very first thing I would do, is I would re-thread the entire machine. And I would also, your bobbin is probably fine if it's bird nesting. You probably don't need to re-thread that, but I would re-thread all of your upper tension. So that is my tip on what to do if your machine bird's nests. The next thing, if your machine is still bird nesting, is, and I'm going to flip back over here and show you some of my notions. If your machine is still bird nesting, the other thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to check your needles. What I find in general, no matter what my machine is doing, you want to re-thread the machine, your upper and your lower, so your bobbin as well, and you may need to change your needle. Needles are, sometimes I think we forget how important these little needles are. But needles are incredibly important because if your needle is dull, your machine is not going to work quite right. And that's because your actual timing of the machine is a little bit off, right? So like when your needle is coming down, right, the function that makes a stitch is you have your bobbin going like this, right, and moving the thread around, and you have your needle coming down, and that combination is what creates the stitch. But that timing has to be right. And as soon as your needle gets dull, it's going just a little bit slower than it's supposed to, and a little bit slower than it's supposed to. And you know what that usually equates to? Skipped stitches. very often when your needle is dull, you might also get skip stitches. And I don't know, you might be able to see this, but a skip stitch is when you're like sewing, looks great, and then big long stitch. And then sewing, looks great, and then big long stitch. And that's because the timing of the needle is off a little bit. And I can get in here, maybe you can see a little bit better when we flip over to this camera here. So you can see regular sewing, great, and then here you can see this really big long stitch. And then sewing, great, and then big long stitch. And this is what a skip stitch may look like. And so skip stitches can happen for lots of reasons, but oftentimes, most of the time, it is because of your needle and you want to put a new needle in. So here we're going to talk about some needles now. There are lots and lots of different types of needles. This set I have here is pretty awesome because it has all the different types in it, right? It has a leather needle, a metallic needle, stretch, ballpoint, jeans, sharps, embroidery, and universal. So using the right needle for the job is definitely very, very helpful. And the thing about needles is needles are really only designed to last for about 8 hours of sewing. And what I tend to do is every time I start a new project, I put a new needle in because one, I want to make sure. I don't always take great notes about what needle is in my machine, to be totally honest with you. I probably should, but I think I'm always going to remember based on what project I did last time, but I don't always remember, or maybe my daughter's been using my sewing machine, right? So I always just start with a new needle when I start a new project, because then I can also pick the needle that is best for the project that I am working on. And you're always going to get better results from your sewing machine if you are using a needle that works best for your project. So there's lots of different types of needles. So if you're working on a knit fabric, a stretch needle might be great. If you're going to use metallic thread, a metallic needle, or if you're going to do embroidery with metallic threads, a metallic needle is going to help you out. The jeans denim needle is really helpful. It's probably one of my favorites because it's designed for heavier duty fabric and it has a little bit sharper point. So each needle, we're not going to go into the specifics of the point of every single needle today. I think we might have another video on that, but just so you know, the actual shape of the needle point is a little bit different on all of these different types of needles. They truly are a little different, and that's why they work better for different things. So for quilting, you generally use a quilting needle that has a sharper point, and the jeans denim needle has a sharper point and works on heavier duty fabric. And then there's the type of needle, but then there's also the size of needle, right? So needle sizes go anywhere from generally 60, which is a small needle, up to 100 or 120, which would be a very large needle. I tend to use mostly 80/12s or 90/14s. There's the top number and the bottom number, and I just think about them usually, you can generally just think about them in that top number. And so I generally use an 80 or 90 needle for most of my sewing because that is for general fabric weight, right? If I'm just going to sew, if I'm sewing if I'm piecing a quilt, which is just a couple layers of cotton, I'm going to use, like an 80/12 quilting needle. If I'm going to do denim, I'm probably going to use a 90/14 denim needle to hem some jeans or do something like that. So picking the right needle is also going to really help you if the machine is not behaving, because sometimes what might happen is the needle itself is just not the right needle for the project, and that's actually the reason why your machine isn't behaving. It's not your machine at all. It just needs the right tool. It needs the right needle. The other thing to know about needles is needles are, they can, every now and again, a defective one will come out of the package. Like it just won't be right. So if for some reason everything, you put a brand new needle in and immediately your machine is not working right, by all means, follow the basic things. Rethread the upper and lower, and if that still doesn't work, put a new needle in it. Oftentimes, a needle is really what the issue is. And every now and again, you get a defective needle, or maybe one time you put an old needle back in your package, because sometimes we do that because we think, oh, we didn't use it very much. It hasn't had 8 hours on it. I'm going to save it. And then you pull it out for a new project, and actually it has a nick in it, because sometimes we can also nick our needles. Like if we accidentally sew over our pins, or we hit something that's harder, like maybe we accidentally hit our foot or any of those things, or if something weird happens and our needle hits our bobbin case while we're sewing, that can also damage your needle, and then your needle's not going to work very well, and so that 8 hours just doesn't mean anything anymore because the needle is dull. it's not, it's been nicked, it's not going to function properly. So change that needle. And that's part of the reason why I highly recommend having a good assortment of needles in just with you all the time next to your sewing machine. So that way when you're sewing, you have plenty of needles, you have the right needles on hand depending on what you're doing. I have even had some fabric, depending on what the fabric is made out of, really, really dull my needles super quickly. One time I made these like cuffs with vinyl, and and the needles, like, they dulled so quickly. Like, it was like I could only make one, and then it started skipping stitches, and I had to put a new needle in. So I went through a lot of needles in that project, but there wasn't anything wrong with my machine. It just needed new needles. So the other thing, I feel like my team's trying to tell me something. Nope, okay. The other thing is thread. So using good thread is always gonna help your stitches. So I have a variety of different thread out here. And we like all of the different, you know, we carry the Metler thread, which is really lovely. We carry the Madeira thread, which is really lovely, good quality thread. We carry the Aurifil. And the key with thread is using good quality thread. Because good quality thread, the dye lights are going to be similar. So if you need another color, when you go and pick it up again, it's going to look like the same color, which is really helpful if you're like mid-project and you need another spool of thread, right? So that's one. Two, good quality thread is less linty, which means it's not going to jam up your machine as much, full of lint and dust, you know, and stuff. Because lint itself can actually be one of the things, and we'll talk about that in a second with those tension discs. So good quality thread, it's going to help for that. And then also it's just going to give you a prettier stitch if you're using good quality thread. So I highly recommend all the thread that Quality Sewing carries is very good thread. You know, sometimes we have like really old thread that maybe it was our grandmother's or something. And while you can try to use it, if you find that that thread breaks a lot, and then it's actually that the thread has actually aged. Just like any form of fabric, it can degrade over time. And that's why it's recommended that you keep thread, you know, not in the light. If you keep it in a drawer or somewhere where it's not in the light, that's helpful for thread. And thread does last a long time, but I'm talking like if you have thread that's on wooden spools and stuff, that is probably really, really old thread, and it is not gonna work as well. And sometimes you might even just get thread, like if I flip back over to my machine here, you might just get thread that gets caught, depending on what's happening up here. It could be getting caught on your, like if you don't have a spool cap on, sometimes just on these little, the little lips of the thread spool itself, your thread can be getting caught, and that can cause issues. So making sure you're using a spool cap that's the right size is going to be really helpful. And then the other thing is when you have this bird nest situation happening, the other thing that is always good to do is it might be that you have a lot of lint or things right in here in your tension area. And so you can use that canned air and you can blow out this area and clean that out. You can clean out around your bobbin case, and that can also help make sure that the tension discs are working properly, because that is going to help make sure that the machine is threaded properly, if that makes sense. So to wrap it up, what are the things that you are going to want to do if your machine's misbehaving? What's the very first thing? Everybody, rethread, right? We're gonna rethread that machine, top and bobbin. We might wanna change that needle, right? We are also going to clean out the machine if there's like a whole bunch of dust and lint, and we wanna use really good thread. And so those are the things to do every time. And even sometimes when I have been tired, and I'm telling you this because it's happened to me and it sounds honestly sort of embarrassing, but I have rethreaded my machine and it wouldn't behave, and it took one more rethread because I was tired and I had been sewing too long. And sometimes these things just happen. So just throw in a new needle and, you know, throw in a different needle, rethread that machine, and, you know, give it a whirl. So hopefully that was helpful to you if you have run into some of these issues and weren't quite sure what to do. And of course, if you live locally in the Puget Sound area in Western Washington, we have 10 lovely stores, and if you can always bring your machine in, and we're happy to sit down with you and take some time to like figure out what's actually going on inside your machine if that does not resolve it. So I would recommend that as well, or you can always give us a call, and sometimes we can even just help you over the phone resolve those sorts of issues. So happy sewing, and we'll see you next week at 10 a.m. for another How Do I?